with me Mr. David Eckhart, who's a Marine veteran of Vietnam. He enlisted after graduating high school in Cincinnati, Ohio in 1969. He spent 3 years in the Marines, part of that in Vietnam and then in Hawaii. Since then, he's attended college. He did security work, security management, corporate management, and supervision for the state of Florida before retiring a few years ago. So he does give regular talks on Marine history in Florida during the Second Seminole War and the Civil War at the Tampa Bay History Center, as well as other events. And he's written magazine articles and a few historical books. And he has been nice enough to agree to answer some questions about his time in the Vietnam War. So I guess first thing is thanks again for talking to me today. But how did you end up in Vietnam? So what was the path that brought you to Vietnam?
Okay, first of all, greetings to everybody out there. Hope everybody's doing well with all this craziness out there. All right, I enlisted in the Marine Corps right after graduation from high school. I had decided I needed to get out and see a little of the world before I went into college. I did go ahead and talk to Army recruiter, Navy recruiter, Air Force recruiter. It was the Marine recruiter that really sells you, a good storyteller. Plus, I had been hanging around with some Hamilton County Sheriff dispatchers that were all former Marines, some of them for Korea. And they all decided that they were just all good guys. And I decided, well, if you're going to go, you go with the best. So I signed up in June and went on the 120-day delay program, which means I didn't have to go until October, which gave me the summer to have a little fun. A friend and I drove from Cincinnati to Wyoming for a few weeks, where my sister and brother-in-law live. A lot of camping, fishing up in the mountains, and I had been taking Taekwondo, and my instructor, who was Korean, and the youngest Korean ever to have a 9th degree black belt, and he was teaching Korean Marines before he left Korea. Anyway, when I told him I was going to Marines, he says, well, you got to come in extra. I'm going to teach you extra because you're going to go to Vietnam. So all summer long, he really worked my butt off teaching me stuff he wouldn't teach anybody else. And fortunately, I'd never had to use it over there. I did have to use it with a couple thieves, one that tried to stab me many years later. So anyway, I ended up in October going to Parris Island, South Carolina boot camp. And I'm sure some of you've probably seen the movie Full Metal Jacket. Well, that's a lot of Hollywood thrown into that, even though the guy playing a drill instructor had really been a drill instructor at one time. But better movie on how boot camp really was is one from the 1950s, the DI. So if you ever get a chance to get that. 13 weeks at boot camp, and they don't try to make you a robot like a lot of people think. The drill instructor job is the toughest job in the Marines, which is to try to make sure you're going to stay alive. And they're taking roughly about 70, 80 guys from 70, 80 different backgrounds and beliefs and everything else, trying to make sure that they can act and react instantly to anything that comes out. So that, and it's really tough training. I think the worst thing for me was the tear gas chamber. You had to go in this room with tear gas, with the gas mask on. They throw in a couple gas grenades, and then after you're in there, making sure it's all tight, then they make you take it off. You run around that room and then run out. And once you take that off, you're supposed to say your name, rank, serial number, and you might get your name out before it chokes you. So that was probably the toughest part. From there, we had 10 days Christmas leave, and then on to infantry training in Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. Whatever your job's going to be in the Marine Corps, you're first a rifleman, so you go through basic infantry training. And North Carolina in the winter is brutal. We were out in the field most of the time with wind chill factors of minus 30 degrees. And the nights that we spent sleeping out, our canteens would freeze overnight. And there was a lot of racial stuff going on at that time, both in civilian life and some in the different services. So there was a little bit of that going on. And um, from there, in boot camp also, I had an interview with the FBI. When you go to boot camp, you go through a whole battery of tests trying to determine what you should be once you get out of boot camp. And what they chose for me was going to be top secret work. So you had to have a top secret clearance. When I went home on leave, my next door neighbor said, the FBI was around asking about you. And, because I had to give them the name of some neighbors, my pastor, teachers, and out of the 300, about 280 to 300 guys in the training battalion there at boot camp, there's only 2 of us that were chosen for this. That's how critical your skill set had to be. You were considered the top 10% of the Marines to get into what I got into.
Why do you think they selected you for that? Like, what do you think about your interview made it that they wanted to do the top secret stuff?
Testing that got me to that. It was the testing scores, and then they chose you for that, and then you had to have the top secret clearance. All right, after we got done at Camp Lejeune, then we were sent down to Corey Station in Pensacola, Florida, where we got to warm up after North Carolina. There we went through our top secret training. And what we were being trained to do would be to intercept enemy communications, which is called signals intelligence. You hear sometimes the news broadcast, they talk about SIGINT. That's short for signals intelligence. And at that time in the 60s and into the 70s, Morse code was still being used considerably. That's a lot of dots and dashes coming across, and it takes a while to really train your ears to be able to pick that up. And we would be sitting at typewriters with earphones on, and it'd be coming across, and so you're learning how to decipher Morse code coming across and type at the same time. From there, we had a little bit of a leave before having to go on to Camp Pendleton, California. And those of us that were going to Vietnam had to go through what was called staging battalion, where you get additional training and preparation for going to Vietnam, more geared toward going through jungle. We had to go through what they called the Viet Cong Trail, which had all kinds of booby traps like you might encounter if you were out in the field. And then you had a live fire along that too, because you'd have targets pop up and you'd have to shoot. Plus more instruction on the culture and those sort of things about Vietnam. The Hindus have a symbol that looks like a Nazi swastika. And there's a lot of Hindus in Vietnam, and some of the first guys over there would see that swastika, only it was reversed, and they would blow it up thinking they're Nazi symbol. Mm. So they ran into problems with some of the local Hindus doing that. But we got a little bit of Vietnamese culture, what to look for, what to do, what not to do with the folks. And from there, boarded the plane. We went from California to Alaska to Japan to Okinawa. And we spent about 4 days on Okinawa storing our stateside gear, getting the gear that we needed to take to Vietnam. And most of us had spent most of our money in California, so we didn't have much to play around with on Okinawa on the weekend. But then got to Vietnam in September of 70. And the first thing you notice when you step off the plane, you're going by commercial airlines. First thing you notice when you step off the plane in Da Nang was you felt like you walked into a wall of heat, and the smell of a lot of diesel fumes from all the electric generators run by diesel fume, and then the smell of rotting vegetation all around. I was assigned to Hill 327, which had a platoon of us guys doing intercept. And we worked in what we affectionately called our secret factory, which was a plywood shack, and there's about 8 or 10 of us at a time on shift copying code. We had each had a radio receiver and typewriter and a lot of paper, and you'd scan the dials to find transmissions, and then you copy. Our main target was North Vietnamese General Bin, and his call sign was GNO, da da it, da it, da da da. And that anytime that call sign was heard, whoever got it notified the Marine that was working the DF net, the direction finding net, and he notified the direction finding sites to get on that frequency and get a bearing on that. Using radio direction finding, you can locate a transmitter. And another Marine would be on the line with artillery and air wing to see who had assets. And as soon as we had a bearing on General Bin, they'd either hit him with artillery or airstrike. And we never got him, but we got a lot of his people. And since we were a need to know kind of thing, we would rarely ever know how good we had done, except for one time when they thought they really had General Bin, and they sent recon out and counted 19 dead, but no general. But that was the only time that we got true feedback on our work at that time. On a need-to-know basis, if you were captured, you wouldn't be able to tell much. And since what we were doing was considered top secret at the time, they didn't want anybody knowing. Now, this is a representation of how the map worked for the DF sites. You'd have 5 separate DF sites, and on the map, there would be a compass wheel. And let's say I'm down here at Hill 119. I got a bearing on the target, so I would call in my compass reading, and Wally Gore would take the string and run it up that way, and then each DF site would call in their bearings, and wherever all those strings intersected, that's where the bad guy was. So he would call in the map coordinates there. What we used in for radio direction finding is this right here. This is one of our guys. That's called a PRD-1.
You might want to tilt your laptop down just a little bit. Can you tilt the laptop or pull that up? Yeah, perfect.
This was a top secret piece of equipment at the time, and about a month ago, I saw one on eBay.
Oh, really?
So these things are way outdated. Anyway, that has a rotating antenna on the compass wheel, and that's how you turn that till you got a null, which means you couldn't hear it anymore, and that's the bearing you would call in. Up there on Hill 327 in October, we got hit by Typhoon Kate, 135-mile-an-hour winds, and those of us who were not in the secret factory copying code were in the open bunker. And when you had to run out to the head or the restroom for civilians, sandblasted by the wind. So 135-mile winds were kind of a interesting thing.
So most people slept in open bunkers. They were just like
yeah, it was sandbag bunker. It did have a roof, but it was open around. You had an opening about that much around there, so even though you're in there, you got that wind circulating there, blowing sand on you all the time. At the end of October, early November,